We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
These are among the most famous words in American letters, and they were destined to immortalize the man who penned them. But when he wrote them, Thomas Jefferson was doing a job that others had rejected.
Jefferson was a member of the Continental Congress in 1775 who had said very little during the course of the debates up till that time. And in fact, Adams says he never heard Jefferson say one or two sentences out loud. He got a reputation as a draftsman, as a person who was not a skilled speaker, but was a skilled writer. And when the time came to draft the Declaration in early June of 1776, a committee was formed. The three most prominent members of the committee were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. Initially, they all thought Franklin would write the Declaration because he was the most famous stylist in the American colonies. And Franklin said that he made it a point never to draft a document that would be edited by a committee. And Adams was the next logical choice, since he is the so-called Atlas of Independence, the man who had taken the lead in the Continental Congress. But he said that he wanted Jefferson to write it for a couple of reasons. He wanted a Virginian to do it because they needed to bring Virginia along in the cause. He also said that he, Adams, had made himself obnoxious to the other members in the Continental Congress by pressing so hard for independence, and therefore the document would attract more criticism. And third, he said, because Jefferson can write 10 times better than I can. We needed someone who, in effect, could create a document that was, at least in many respects, a piece of propaganda. And Jefferson was naturally disposed to do that.
Transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun.
The world, in Jefferson's own imagination, was divided between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And therefore, he brought a kind of natural framework of his own that allowed us to see the British king in the most horrible way. And secondly, he had a lyrical capacity. He had the capacity to craft language that floated above events and that allowed you to look up and lift your head, and for different constituencies and different people to hear that language in the way that they would like to hear it.
Once the task of composing the Declaration had been placed on Jefferson's shoulders, he settled down in his Philadelphia apartments and wrote the first draft quickly. However, while in that room hard at work, he was not entirely alone.
Neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing, I drew my ideas from the harmonizing sentiments of the day.
Jefferson was himself a product of the Enlightenment in the sense that he had read books, both from French writers and English writers, that suggested that the medieval era was now over, that Jefferson agreed with Voltaire, one of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, that the last king should be strangled with the entrails of the last priest, and therefore that we were in a new world in which kings and priests would not rule, but the people at large would rule, and natural forces and reasonable men would be able to govern each other.
Well, the notion of all men are created equal is really a powerful notion that is new. That is, the Enlightenment. There was always a Christian basis to equality, but this is a secular equality that's being appealed to. And the notion that government rests on the consent of the people, those are powerful notions, and those are new, and for the 18th century, new doctrines with great power.
But the Enlightenment notion of equality and Jefferson's own vision were far narrower than our modern understanding.
Initially, I don't think it meant any more than as a people, the now separate people, the Americans are equal to any other people on earth. That's, I think, what Jefferson had in mind, because all you have to do is look at his own life, where he certainly didn't practice equality with the women in his life, let alone with his slaves. But the interest of the word, the interest of the concept, is that other people could come along and say, yes, this applies to me too. And that begins almost instantly, and it's still going on to the present day.
Jefferson was not entirely comfortable with the gap between the ideal of equality and the reality of American slavery. He tried to resolve this in the first draft of the Declaration by laying the blame for the slave trade on King George.
He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery.
This passage proved too awkward for a Congress who didn't want any mention of slavery in a document that purported to promote liberty and equality.
This is debated and excised almost completely, and there are a couple of possible reasons. One is that they don't want, the members of the Continental Congress don't want any mention of slavery in this document to begin with. Because it's an awkward truth that these are men talking about liberty who are also continuing to permit slavery to exist. It's a controversial issue, in other words, and would divide the delegations from the North and the South. In addition, it's a preposterous claim to argue that George III is responsible for slavery. Jefferson's actual position in the paragraph he writes is very popular in Virginia at that time. In Virginia at that time, it is very popular to oppose the slave trade, but not to oppose slavery per se. All the Virginia planters already had their plantations well stocked. Therefore, ending the slave trade increased the value of their slaves, and that became the position that most Virginians had throughout the rest of the 18th century. They can sound like they're talking against slavery, and they want to sound that way, but they're really only talking against the slave trade.
And Thomas Jefferson was always conflicted over this. I think that Thomas Jefferson was ambivalent about the fact that he wasn't able to live up to his own personal principles. And in some ways, you know, Thomas Jefferson is America, because that's what we as Americans are conflicted about. We got great principles, but we can't always live up to them. And sometimes we don't really try. And that makes us feel strange about ourselves. I think in some ways Jefferson felt strange about himself.